We talk about the 1950s like they were golden years, all teddy boys and rock and roll and newfound prosperity. But behind those cheerful newsreels and optimistic headlines, millions of British families were living in conditions that would shock you today. Damp walls running with condensation, children sharing beds in freezing rooms, mothers stretching rations that somehow still existed years after the war ended. This is the story we rarely tell, the Britain that polite society preferred to forget. This is what poverty really looked like. When the guns fell silent in 1945, Britain faced a reality that victory parades could not disguise. The country was broken, not just spiritually but physically and economically. Cities lay in ruins from years of bombing, the national coffers were empty, and debts to America ran into billions. The promise of a better tomorrow felt very distant when you were queuing for your weekly ration of meat that barely filled a sandwich. What many people forget, or perhaps never knew, is that rationing did not end with the war. It continued for almost a decade afterwards, with some items remaining restricted until 1954. That means families who had endured 6 years of wartime privation faced another 9 years of limited food, limited fuel, and limited hope. Meat was one of the last items to come off the ration books, and until then, a proper Sunday roast remained a luxury that many working-class families could only dream about. The economy did begin to recover in the second half of the decade, and politicians loved to trumpet the statistics. But those numbers meant nothing to the mother in Manchester trying to feed 5 children on a factory worker's wage. If you want to understand 50s poverty, you must understand the housing. The war had destroyed or damaged hundreds of thousands of homes, but the problem went deeper than bomb craters. Britain's housing stock had been inadequate before the war even started, and now it was catastrophic. Families lived in conditions that belonged to the Victorian era, not the atomic age. Picture this: a terraced house in any industrial city, built 80 years earlier for workers who were never expected to live long or comfortably. The walls were thin, the windows rattled, and damp climbed up from the foundations like a living thing. In winter, ice formed on the inside of bedroom windows. Families would wake to find frost patterns on their blankets where their breath had frozen overnight. There was no central heating, often no bathroom, sometimes no indoor toilet at all. The slums were not just uncomfortable, they were dangerous. Overcrowding meant diseases spread quickly, and respiratory illnesses were endemic in communities where families of 6 or 7 shared 2 rooms. Children slept 3 or 4 to a bed, head to toe, fighting for blankets. Parents often gave up their own beds entirely, sleeping in chairs or on floors so their children could have something resembling rest. The concept of personal space did not exist for the poorest families. Imagine raising your children in a single room where you cooked, ate, slept, washed, and tried to maintain some dignity as human beings. This was reality for far too many, and the psychological toll was immense. Photographs from the era, many taken by concerned journalists and housing campaigners, show scenes that look more like refugee camps than British homes. Laundry hanging from makeshift lines strung across living spaces because there was nowhere else to dry it. Beds pushed against walls that were visibly damp and crumbling. Children doing homework by candlelight because the electricity meter had run out and there was no money for another shilling. The lack of private bathrooms meant families shared facilities with neighbours, sometimes entire streets using the same outdoor toilets. Bath night was a weekly ritual involving a tin tub in front of the fire, everyone taking turns in water that grew colder and dirtier with each occupant. Privacy was impossible, and dignity was something you learned to live without. For children growing up in these conditions, the effects lasted a lifetime. Educational achievement suffered when you had no quiet place to study. Health problems developed from years of breathing damp air and inadequate nutrition. And the shame, The constant awareness that your family was poor and everyone knew it left scars that no amount of later prosperity could fully heal. Ask anyone who lived through 50s. Poverty, what they remember most vividly, and many will mention the cold. Not ordinary cold, not the kind you solve with an extra jumper, but a penetrating, relentless cold that seemed to live in the walls and floors and never truly went away. Heating a home required fuel, and fuel cost money that families simply did not have. Coal was the primary source of warmth, but coal was expensive and had to be carried home in buckets from the merchant. Families rationed their coal more carefully than their food, lighting fires only when absolutely necessary and letting them die as early as possible. Children did their homework wearing coats and gloves. Families gathered in one room and closed off the rest of the house to conserve whatever warmth they could generate. The combination of cold and damp created health problems that shortened lives and ruined childhoods. Bronchitis was rampant in working-class communities, and pneumonia killed thousands every winter. Old people died in their beds from hypothermia, found by neighbours who had not seen them for days. The death certificates might say natural causes, but poverty was the real killer. Even when fuel was available, many homes simply could not retain heat. Poor insulation, gaps around windows and doors, and construction methods designed for maximum profit rather than minimum comfort meant that whatever warmth you generated escaped almost immediately. The ration book dominated family life well into the 50s. Each person was entitled to specific amounts of specific foods, and stretching those amounts to feed hungry children required creativity that bordered on genius. Mothers became experts at making something from nothing, creating meals from scraps that would feed a family and leave everyone still slightly hungry. Meat was the greatest luxury and the most missed. The weekly ration provided barely enough for one proper meal, so meat was reserved for Sunday dinner and used to flavour dishes throughout the week. Dripping, the fat rendered from cooking, became a spread for bread when butter was unavailable. Offal, that most families today would refuse to eat, was prized and fought over. The end of rationing in 1954 brought relief, but not abundance. Food was now available, but availability meant nothing without money to buy it. Working class families continued to eat simply and sparingly, their diets heavy on bread, potatoes and whatever vegetables they could grow or afford. Fresh fruit remained a rare treat, and children who grew up in poverty often entered adulthood having never tasted foods that wealthier families took for granted. Employment in the 50s was plentiful, but that did not mean workers prospered. The factories, mines and mills that powered British industry required endless labour, and they got it from men and women who had few other options. You worked because you had to, not because the work would lift you out of poverty. Wages were calculated to cover basic survival and little else. A factory worker might earn enough to pay rent, buy food and keep the lights on, but savings were impossible, and any unexpected expense meant crisis. A broken window, a sick child, a death in the family requiring funeral costs. These ordinary events could push families over the edge into genuine destitution. If anyone bore the heaviest burden of 50s poverty, it was the mothers. They were the ones who performed daily miracles with empty cupboards and thin purses, the ones who went without so their children could eat, the ones who somehow maintained homes in conditions that would defeat most people today. Their sacrifice was constant, invisible, and rarely acknowledged. A working-class mother in the 50s woke before dawn and rarely stopped moving until long after dark. She lit the fire, prepared breakfast from whatever scraps remained, got children ready for school, then began the endless cycle of washing, cleaning, mending and cooking that defined her days. Washing alone was a full day's labour, done by hand in a copper tub, clothes scrubbed on a washboard, wrung out by hand and hung to dry in whatever space could be found. Ironing followed, then mending, because clothes were worn until they fell apart and then sewn back together again. Shopping required strategy that would impress a military commander. Mothers knew which shops reduced prices at closing time, which market stalls sold bruised vegetables cheaply, which butchers might give away bones for soup if you asked nicely. Every penny was accounted for, every purchase weighed against competing needs. Childhood in poverty was brief. Children were expected to contribute to the household from the moment they were capable, and innocence was a luxury their families could not afford. By the age of 7 or 8, most working-class children had responsibilities that would seem cruel by modern standards, and they accepted them because everyone they knew lived the same way. Before school, children might be sent to queue at shops, fetch water if the house lacked plumbing, or help younger siblings dress and eat. After school, there were more chores, errands to run, coal to carry, and whatever odd jobs might earn a few pennies for the family pot. Homework, if it existed at all, was done in stolen moments between obligations, often by inadequate light in crowded rooms where concentration was impossible. Many children worked outside the home as well, despite laws that supposedly prohibited child labour. Paper rounds started before dawn, requiring children to walk miles in all weather before school even began. Older children worked in shops on weekends, ran errands for neighbours, or helped on market stalls. Every shilling earned went to their mothers, not to themselves. The idea of pocket money for sweets or comics belonged to another world entirely. The creation of the National Health Service in 1948 was revolutionary, and its impact on the poor cannot be overstated. For the first time in British history, medical care was available to everyone, regardless of ability to pay. Families who had avoided doctors because they could not afford the bill now had access to treatment that saved lives. But the NHS, magnificent as it was, could not solve poverty on its own. It could treat the bronchitis caused by damp housing, but it could not fix the damp housing. It could address the effects of malnutrition, but it could not put food on tables. The welfare state created after the war provided a safety net that previous generations had lacked, but that net had holes and many families fell through. Council housing programs eventually transformed the landscape, demolishing slums and building new homes for hundreds of thousands of families. But these programs took decades to complete, and for those living in condemned properties waiting for rehousing, each year felt like a lifetime. Numbers tell us how many suffered, but they cannot convey what suffering actually looked like. For that, we need the photographs and testimonies that campaigners collected, the human faces of poverty that eventually shocked the nation into action. The Mass Observation Archive contains thousands of accounts from ordinary people describing their daily lives in the 40s and 50s. These are not statistics, but stories told in the words of those who lived them. A mother describing how she fed her children before herself and went hungry so they could eat. A father explaining the shame of not being able to provide properly for his family despite working every hour available. Children recounting the cold, the hunger, the awareness that they were different from luckier classmates. Photographs taken for housing campaigns show conditions that seem impossible in a developed nation. Children playing in rubble that had not been cleared since the war. Public awareness of housing conditions grew throughout the 50s and 60s, eventually creating political pressure that accelerated slum clearance and social housing construction. The poverty of the 50s did not end overnight, but it did not go unwitnessed. The 1950s were harder than the nostalgia industry wants us to remember. For millions of British families, that decade meant cold homes, empty bellies, and a daily struggle that left marks lasting generations. We remember it now, not to diminish those who survived it, but to honour their resilience and ensure we never forget what ordinary people endured. So tell us in the comments, did your family live through these conditions? And what stories did they pass down to you?